Hello, my name is Tyler Wilson, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here to this discussion around There Are Not 36 Ways of Showing a Man Getting on a Horse. Here with me from the film are director Nicolás Zukerfeld and co-writer and co-editor Malena Solarz. Welcome, Nicolás. Welcome, Malena. And we have here Cordelia Montes, who will assist us with translations. Well, I'll start with the beginning of this film. Was for you, by the end of the film, we're given this explanation as to how this very film got made, but I'm not so sure how much that reflects the reality behind the film's origins. To be honest, the first time I saw this film, I wasn't entirely sure what was real and what was fabricated. So could you just start off by sharing how the project got started for you?
Ok. Entendí. Ahora, bueno, el proceso de realización de la película fue muy parecido a como está en la película.
The filmmaking process of the movie was very much like the way it's described in the movie.
Eso siendo una película en la que íbamos solamente a intentar probar lo que había dicho Raoul Walsh en su frase, es decir, tratar de buscar todas las películas de Walsh en las que aparecieran personas subiendo a caballo.
When the film started, the idea was just to illustrate what Walsh said in that phrase. So the idea was just to make a compilation of all of men getting on horses.
Para eso junté a un grupo de amigos para que vean las películas y detecten solamente esos momentos en las películas de Walsh.
And to do that, I recruited a group of friends that would watch all of these films and jot down where these moments happened.
Pero en un momento dado tuve que citar la frase de Walsh para un fondo de subsidio económico y me empecé a obsesionar con citarla con propiedad.
And at some point, I found myself having to quote Walsh's phrase to a committee for funds to subsidize the film, and I became obsessed with wanting to cite it with authority.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, or to talk a bit more about the shape of the film, like how you arrived at these two different parts. As you mentioned, one of your colleagues, as you were making the film, alluded to this project as a kind of detective story. And as I was watching it, and I mentioned this in my introduction, I was reminded of many different kinds of genres, but also different types of forms to a film, whether that's like it reminded me of an essay film, a compilation film, a kind of journal film, and also constantly reminding you of mysteries and comedies and adventure films. So, and amid all of this, there is this tension between classical cinema and experimental cinema. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk more about this tension between these two parts in the film and how you arrived at ultimately that shape.
Bueno, en primer lugar, nunca tuve una forma muy determinada, más que en principio compilar los fragmentos de las películas de Walsh.
First of all, I never really had like a particular form that I was aiming for, aside from just compiling all of these fragments of Walsh's movies.
Pero cuando vi en un festival la película Star, la de Johann Lurf, y The Green Fog, justamente, me di cuenta de que había un tipo de película similar que podía ser posible.
But then after watching Star with Johann Lurf and Green Fog, I realized that there was another way, there was another form that it could take.
No quería copiar esa forma, pero sabía que había algo ahí que me ayudaba a pensar mi propia película.
I didn't want to copy the form, but I knew that there was something there that could help me sort through my own.
Y la película se fue armando y se fue desarmando a medida que la investigación iba avanzando también.
And the film started to get constructed and deconstructed as well, as we started getting more information.
Por lo que la investigación detectivesca llegó muy tardíamente a la película, incluso sin saber cómo iba a terminar, dado que Kosarinski no sabíamos si iba a responder el mail, por ejemplo.
So this detective style that came upon the film started to impose itself pretty early on, even before we got everything done, because at some point we didn't even know if Kosarinski was going to reply.
Son esos, que no haya respondido, son esos fracasos luminosos del documental también.
So the non-responses are also those kind of illuminating failures of the film.
Finalmente, estas dos partes iban a funcionar como una pregunta y una respuesta, ¿no?
Finally, these two distinct parts were going to function as a kind of question and answer.
O la práctica y la teoría.
Or practice and theory, if you will.
Eso.
So maybe to start with part one, and Malena, maybe you can jump in to maybe discuss this part of the editing process. There's a very considered flow to the excerpts where we definitely get a clue as to certain match cuts that create their own kind of story where, you know, one clip alludes to perhaps what we might see in the next one. And of course, aside from the broader theme of seeing characters mount or dismount a horse or walk through doorways, I'm wondering if there were other principles that you had in mind as you were connecting these excerpts from the Walsh films in part one.
Hubo muchos criterios distintos, hubo muchas versiones de esa misma parte 1.
We had a lot of different criteria. There were a lot of versions of that first part.
Y el trabajo en general tenía dos maneras de avanzar. Una era muy organizada, clasificando cada fragmento según determinados criterios, si eran mujeres, si eran personas militares, o si eran, no sé, indios, si era una película de época o un western.
And there were two ways to go forward. One of them was a very organized way, you know, something like maybe putting together everything that was like, you know, like that was like military, or if they were the women that were mounting on the horses, Indians, if it was, you know, films that were like Western or of the time.
Y la otra manera era más impulsiva o azarosa, y era más empezar a probar casi de manera aleatoria fragmentos dispersos y ver qué historia se iba conectando, qué iba pasando espontáneamente en la película.
And the other way was a little bit more impulsive and was basically kind of just grabbing a lot of these fragments at random and seeing what would start to come out of it, what story could start to come out of it on its own.
Y íbamos de una manera a la otra constantemente, volviendo a buscar algunas piezas que nos parecían importantes y tirándolas a ver cómo funcionaban en el timeline junto con el resto de los fragmentos.
And we switched back and forth from these two ways, from these impulsive and organized ways. And, you know, we would go back to look for specific fragments that we thought were important and to start weaving them in.
Y tal vez otra cosa que tiene que ver con la estructura de la película es que terminamos de alguna manera copiando esa misma forma de la investigación, de ir de los caballos a las puertas, en los fragmentos de las películas de Walsh.
And something else that kind of came into the structure of that first part was actually from the second part. We were kind of copying the investigation, you know, starting from with horses and then moving to the door.
Y eso fue un poco planificado y otro poco un encuentro más azaroso.
And some of it was planned, and some of it was a little more random.
So maybe we can go into part two, because that takes us into a really different mode of filmmaking. I mean, when there is something to look at, mainly it's a still of a scanned piece of writing or an email exchange. So it's really driving that this part is the writing, and it moves like a short story and endlessly entertaining. And I'm curious how you settled on that tone for the writing of the second part.
Fue muy difícil, sobre todo desde qué lugar iba a narrar esa historia.
It was really hard, especially to find from what place, from where was I narrating this story.
Es decir, el punto de vista, el lugar del narrador.
And I mean the point of view, the place where is the narrator at? What's their point of view?
La primera pregunta que surgió y que tal vez determinó un poco el tono era si iba a ser narrado en primera persona o en tercera persona.
The first question that we had, and that perhaps guided the tone, was whether if it was going to be a first person or third person.
Porque de alguna manera eso me involucraba directamente con la narración o no.
Because in some way it involved me directly with the narration or not.
Pero después descubrí, después de discutirlo mucho con varias personas, que la tercera persona tal vez era la mejor para generar una distancia y poder tener mayor libertad a la hora de construir una ficción.
But then I discovered, and after talking to other people, that using that third person narrator gave me a little bit of distance and allowed me to embrace a kind of liberty in creating this fiction.
Soy yo, la voz en off, pero también yo es otro.
So it's me, I'm the voice, the on off, but I'm also the other.
Eso no significaba que iba a rechazar cualquier relación con la realidad. Más bien lo contrario, eso me permitía jugar mucho más con los elementos y los archivos que provenían de la realidad.
And on the contrary, that didn't mean that I was stepping completely away from the reality of the film, but it allowed me to play with the elements of this reality.
El tono entonces iba a ser un tono sobrio, pero no frío, y con cierta distancia.
So the tone, it would be somber, but not cold, and with a certain distance.
Eso permitía jugar más con personas reales, con archivos reales, pero también tratar de volverlo interesante, que no sea puramente científico todo eso.
That allowed me to play with the real archives, with real people, but it also allowed me to give it a sense that it wouldn't be completely scientific.
Okay. It's a response, yeah.
So maybe you sort of bring it up toward the end of your answer. If you can maybe just talk more about what just interests you about working, for the most part, strictly with found or archival materials. And more than that, you're also really you're deeply engaging with cinema culture to the extent that you're turning critics and critic friends and filmmakers into actors themselves, or unknowing actors. And I'm wondering if you can maybe just talk more about that.
It's a two-part question.
I get that.
The first part, what was the first part of the question?
Just what?
For the archives.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Como su interacción con los archivos y el sonido.
Hay una decisión en la película que es la de utilizar los archivos que yo obtenía por correo electrónico, por mail, o que tenía físicamente.
There was a decision to use for the film the archives that I had physically, or the ones that I was receiving electronically.
Al mismo tiempo, hay un tercer archivo, que son los archivos que el profesor busca en Internet.
At the same time, we also have the archives that are, the ones that the professor looks up online.
En todo lo demás, la decisión iba a ser utilizar pantallas en negro.
In everything else, the decision would be to use screens in black.
Eso.
Un agregado, que también la pantalla en negro nos permitía descansar un poco después de tanto ritmo acelerado de la parte 1.
And then I just want to add something to that black screen, it also allowed us to have a bit of a rest after that continuous images of that first part.
Por eso,
I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier that the film was completed in lockdown, so I'm curious if that had any bearing on the way the film ultimately ended, or no.
No, es que me río porque lo editamos en el verano de aquí, que fue en enero y febrero, fue justo antes de la cuarentena, de la pandemia.
No, I laughed because we actually edited that in our summer, January, February, which was right before the pandemic.
Entonces pasamos esos 2-3 meses encerrados y después todos estos meses encerrados.
So we spent all of those months cooked up doing this, and then after that, we spent more months cooked up.
And the second part of the question was about?
La de los críticos amigos.
The friends and the critics. Como decía antes, la decisión era trabajar de la manera más parecida posible a cómo había sido esa investigación.
So like I said before, the idea was to work in the most similar way that investigation took place.
Entonces eso iba a permitir, y eso iba a generar que inevitablemente aparecieran amigos míos que son críticos, que tal vez no son tan conocidos, mezclados con personas de mayor renombre, como Luis Corecki, por ejemplo.
So that would mean that inevitably, like friends of mine who are critics, perhaps not as well known, would come up in the film next to very well known critics like Luis Corecki.
Y que todos iban a formar parte de esa investigación absurda y extraña en la que finalmente los estaba metiendo.
And they were all gonna be part of this weird, absurd investigation that I was making them a part of. I was forcing them to do.
Un agregado también. Creo que el criterio que usamos fue que en la medida en la que había pasado o esa persona nos había aportado alguna información o nos había mandado algún documento, ya estaba bajo el radar de la ficción de este relato, y después simplemente les pedimos autorización para incluirlos.
I also want to add that really our criteria for involving certain people were as we happen to get documents or information or research from them, we would automatically be thinking of putting them in, and it was just a matter of getting their authorization.
Y obviamente la investigación duró mucho más, la investigación real duró mucho más tiempo que la investigación de ficción. En la investigación ficcional está completamente concentrado en un día y medio.
And evidently, the real research, the real investigation process that we did took a much longer than the fictional did. I mean, we just kind of tried to put it all in it all takes place in 1.5 days in the film.
I have just one more question. Obviously the title of the film is in reference to a quote that is attributed to Raoul Walsh, but at the end of the film, it's sort of mentioned in a sort of offhand way that directors like John Ford and Howard Hawks formulated similar statements in relation to shooting action. And so I'm just curious, what was it about Raoul Walsh and his body of work that made you stick with him as the subject, and just what was it about him that made him an apt focus for the film?
La razón es que la frase en principio es de Raoul Walsh.
The reason why is because that first phrase is Walsh's.
Pero claro, hay un montón de cineastas que pertenecen a un periodo y a una forma cinematográfica similar a la de Walsh, como John Ford o Howard Hawks.
But of course, there are a bunch of directors from that period that belong to that period and that form, just like John Ford and Howard Hawks.
Raoul Walsh, si bien está en el corazón de cierto tipo de cinefilia, es un director caracterizado también como tal vez el director más transparente, más invisible de los cineastas de Hollywood.
And Raoul Walsh, even though he's in the heart of many cinephiles, he is a director that is that among all of these other directors of the era was kind of transparent and invisible.
El cine clásico afirma, todo lo que vemos es lo que es.
Classic cinema takes a stand on it affirms that everything that we see is what is.
Y un poco el juego con la película era mostrar ese carácter del cine clásico experimentando con él. De ahí los límites entre el clasicismo y la experimentación, ¿no?
And part of what the movie wanted to do was to play a little bit with that classic cinema, and to play with the boundaries between classicism and the experimental.
Nos dimos cuenta, montando la película, lo resistentes que son las imágenes de un cineasta como Raoul Walsh.
We noticed while editing the film how resistant the images from Raoul Walsh were.
Es decir, que esas imágenes remiten invariablemente a la película en la que están, por más que uno quiera atacarlas, intervenirlas, modificarlas.
In other words, those fragments, they constantly draw you to the film where it comes from, no matter how much you want to intervene, no matter how much you want to cut and rearrange them.
Esa resistencia es también la resistencia del cine clásico.
And that resistance is that same resistance from the classical cinema.
Y Raoul Walsh tal vez, y una cosa más, y Raoul Walsh tal vez sea uno de esos cineastas como Ford o como Hawks, pero que no se suele mencionar y que termina siendo un paradigma de esa resistencia.
And just one more thing that I want to add, and Raoul Walsh, he's part of those filmmakers like Ford and like Hawk, but he's a paradigm also of that resistance.
That feels like a good note to end on. Nicolás and Malena, thank you so much for speaking about this.
Thank you, Tyler.
Cordelia, thank you for translating.
Thank you, Cordelia.
De nada, un placer.